The man history remembers as Robert Oppenheimer entered the world on April 22, 1904, christened Julius Robert Oppenheimer in New York City. He soon became known predominantly by his middle name, and is commonly referred to today as either Robert Oppenheimer or J. Robert Oppenheimer. Robert's birth was into a well-to-do Jewish family in New York City. His father, Julius, was born in the Hesse-Nassau province within the Kingdom of Prussia, in what had become the unified German Empire just months before his birth in May 1871. Amidst a period of escalating anti-Semitism throughout Western and Central Europe, Julius Oppenheimer departed Germany in 1888 at the age of 17, setting his sights on the United States. Despite arriving with practically no money, he thrived in America. By the time Robert was born in 1904, he had ascended to the position of a prosperous executive at one of Manhattan's foremost textile manufacturing firms. Robert's mother, Ella Friedman, also of Jewish ancestry, was born in New York in 1870. Her family, comprised of German Jews, had emigrated to America a generation before Julius Oppenheimer. She was an artist, and it was from her that Robert acquired some of his aesthetic sensibilities regarding the organization of existence and the cosmos. Ella and Julius would have one more son named Frank. Born 8 years after Robert in 1912, Frank would follow in his older brother's footsteps, embarking on a career in physics. Robert's upbringing was one of privilege. By the middle of the 1900s, his father had risen to become a figure of considerable influence within New York's business community. In the early 1910s, the family relocated to a substantial apartment on West 88th Street in Manhattan, with views of the Central Park Reservoir, situated in one of New York City's most affluent districts at the time. Within their home, the family displayed original creations by Vincent van Gogh and Pablo Picasso, among other notable artists. Robert's education commenced at the Ethical Culture School, followed by the Alcuin Preparatory School, both recognized as two of New York's most exceptional educational institutions in the early 20th century. By the age of 5, he had already cultivated a fascination with mineralogy, a pastime he inherited from his German grandfather. His aptitude was so remarkable that, at the age of 11, he gained admission to the Mineralogical Club of New York City. His advanced development persisted into his secondary school years. He completed his education at Alcuin a year and a half ahead of the usual time frame, accomplishing 2 grade levels in a single year and being accelerated through the 8th grade. By this point, his interests had broadened beyond mineralogy to encompass the more demanding sciences, particularly chemistry. However, it was ultimately physics that would emerge as his true destiny in the coming years. In 1922, Oppenheimer commenced his higher education at Harvard University at the age of 18. Initially, Robert planned to concentrate on chemistry, but he soon redirected his focus to physics. Nonetheless, his prior engagement with chemistry and his wide-ranging intellectual curiosity would prove invaluable in later years, during a period when scientists were increasingly specializing in narrow fields. While pursuing his studies at America's most historic college, he was profoundly influenced by the instruction of Professor Percy Bridgman, an experimental physicist who was a member of the Harvard faculty at that time. This era also saw students at Harvard and other prestigious American universities continuing to explore a diverse array of disciplines. Oppenheimer immersed himself in history and the classical works of Greece and Rome, which still held a central position in many Western educational curricula during the 1920s. When reflecting on his Harvard years later in life, Oppenheimer mentioned that he devoted the majority of his time to the library, engaging in extensive reading. He even enrolled in a greater number of courses than were strictly required. The culmination of this in 1925 was Oppenheimer's graduation with a Bachelor of Arts summa cum laude after a mere 3 years at Harvard. This accolade typically required 4 years to achieve, but Oppenheimer, consistent with an established pattern, completed it in a shorter duration. Even before his graduation from Harvard, Oppenheimer had secured acceptance to proceed with his studies at Cambridge University in England. At the time, Cambridge stood as the preeminent hub for the study of physics in Britain, a distinction it has maintained and fostered since Isaac Newton's time there in the late 17th century. The year Oppenheimer spent at Cambridge, spanning from the autumn of 1925 to the summer of 1926, played a formative role in his development. There, he was exposed to the tutelage of Lord Ernest Rutherford, a physicist born in New Zealand who is widely regarded as the progenitor of nuclear physics today. As an example, it was Rutherford who initially discovered and elucidated the concepts of nuclear half-life and its associated radiation, a feat for which Rutherford was bestowed with a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1908. As his first year at Cambridge neared its conclusion, Oppenheimer, whose talents were beginning to garner significant recognition among European physicists, accepted an invitation from the German physicist Max Born to pursue studies under his mentorship at the University of Göttingen in Germany, a renowned European center of intellectual pursuit. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer engaged in studies alongside a number of his peers who would ascend to prominence in the realm of theoretical physics during the 20th century. Notable among these were Werner Heisenberg, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller, some of whom Oppenheimer would later collaborate with during the Manhattan Project amidst the Second World War. Remarkably, Oppenheimer was granted his PhD in physics in the spring of 1927, less than a year following his arrival in Göttingen. The internal examiner, James Franck, who had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics 2 years prior in 1925, is famously recounted to have expressed a sense of relief upon the conclusion of the oral examination, or viva voce. He stated that Oppenheimer had not only adeptly defended his doctoral research, but had also appeared poised to commence questioning Franck himself. The immense potential that Oppenheimer displayed as a theoretical physicist, as he attained his PhD around the age of 23, was most conspicuously demonstrated in a paper he co-authored with Born on the quantum theory of molecules in 1927. This publication articulated what has become recognized as the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. This concept relates to the domain of molecular dynamics, specifically the study of how molecules move and interact. The approximation, as demonstrated by Born and Oppenheimer, revealed that the wave functions of nuclei and electrons within a molecule exhibit differences, attributable to the substantially greater mass of nuclei in comparison to electrons. This disparity implies that the coordinates of the nuclei remain relatively stationary, while the lighter electrons are more significantly influenced by wave functions, resulting in their coordinates being more dynamic. The pair arrived at this approximation largely due to Oppenheimer's dual fascinations with chemistry and physics, as the theory they presented incorporated principles of both quantum chemistry and molecular physics. In practical application, the approximation proved significant by enabling scientists from the late 1920s onward to differentiate between the movement of a nucleus and that of an electron. The person who elucidated this concept with Max Born and earned his PhD at Göttingen was an individual of intriguing complexity. Oppenheimer presented a blend of a reserved scientist and a comparatively affable personality, oscillating between introversion and extroversion as dictated by circumstance or his prevailing mood. A chronic smoker, he was consistently enveloped in a cloud of smoke throughout his adult life, a practice that would significantly contribute to his untimely demise in his early 60s. Those who were acquainted with him during his time at Harvard, Cambridge, and Göttingen recounted a person exhibiting an unusual combination of intellect and a surprising degree of naivete at times, frequently displaying flawed judgment and decision-making and a proclivity for exaggeration. As the years progressed, he developed a discernible streak of arrogance, although this was counterbalanced by a generosity of intellect towards those who studied and collaborated with him, as well as those he instructed in later years. A prominent facet of his character was his profound interest in Eastern philosophy and mysticism, with a particular focus on Hinduism and Confucianism. He even undertook the study of Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism, in order to engage with the ancient texts of this faith in their original form. This engagement with religion and mysticism was not a mere unconventional pursuit. For Oppenheimer, the exploration of physics served as a conduit to comprehending the mystical dimensions of the universe and existence. His broader intellectual perspective was characterized by open-minded inquiry rather than a relentless quest for concrete scientific facts. However, there also existed an unstable and unpredictable dimension to Oppenheimer's personality. His conduct at Harvard was occasionally subject to scrutiny by fellow students and instructors. In 1926, during his time at Cambridge, he purportedly contaminated an apple with substances capable of inducing illness and placed it in the office of his tutor, Patrick Blackett, with whom he shared a strained relationship, prior to embarking on a holiday to France. This act, and potentially others, resulted in a brief threat of suspension from his studies at Cambridge. A close associate of his during the 1920s, Francis Ferguson, who subsequently achieved recognition as a theorist of stage performance and drama, asserted that Oppenheimer had once physically assaulted him, attempting to strangle him upon being informed of Ferguson's impending marriage. Underpinning this unpredictable behavior was a peculiar amalgamation of an individual capable of remarkable arrogance, leading to conflicts with numerous colleagues over time, yet who many biographers have described as profoundly insecure. The origins of this insecurity may be traced to Oppenheimer's status as the son of a German Jewish immigrant in America during a period when anti-Semitism was widespread throughout the Western world. He was a perpetual outsider, or at least perceived himself as such, and was known to experience frequent bouts of depression. In short, he presented a considerable enigma. Following the culmination of his studies at Göttingen and the publication of several additional papers based on his research endeavors in England and Germany, Oppenheimer made his return to the United States. He briefly held fellowships at Harvard and the California Institute of Technology, interspersed with brief sojourns to Europe to work at the University of Leiden, in the Netherlands, and at Zurich in Switzerland, where Albert Einstein had conducted much of his groundbreaking early research. During his time in Leiden, he acquired the nickname Oppie, derived from a Baudelarized Dutch adaptation of his name. It was not until 1929 that Oppenheimer re-established himself permanently in America, having been presented with a multitude of job offers from various U.S. universities. He accepted 2 such offers, assuming the role of Associate Professor of Physics at both the University of California at Berkeley and the California Institute of Technology, commonly known as Caltech. For the subsequent 13 years, spanning from 1929 to 1942, he would maintain concurrent positions at both institutions, conducting lectures during the autumn and winter semesters at Berkeley, followed by the spring term spent teaching at Caltech in Pasadena. Throughout the 1930s, Oppenheimer garnered acclaim within the American physics community for his pedagogical approaches. The most accomplished physicists of mid-20th century America received their training under his guidance at Berkeley and Caltech, within the School of Theoretical Physics that he established. This school typically comprised a cohort of approximately a dozen advanced graduate students and research fellows who engaged in close collaboration with Oppenheimer on some of the most pressing inquiries within the field of theoretical physics at that time. During periods of heightened academic activity, they would frequently convene on a daily basis, with Oppenheimer interrogating them regarding their advancements and offering guidance accordingly. For the most part, as several biographers who were acquainted with him during that era later recounted, he served as an inspiration to his students, imparting to them the notion that they were at the vanguard of addressing some of the most significant questions confronting humanity at that time. Nevertheless, it was an environment of intellectual diversity. When not engrossed in discussions of physics, Oppenheimer and his colleagues were often observed engaging with Plato's writings in the original Greek or delving into the study of Sanskrit. Hans Bethe, who knew Oppenheimer during this period, later reminisced that Robert maintained a considerable detachment from the broader world during the late 1920s and 30s in California, only becoming aware of the Wall Street crash of late 1929, several months after its occurrence. Significant scientific advancements were achieved by Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech throughout the 1930s. In 1930, as an illustration, Oppenheimer authored a paper that effectively predicted the existence of the positron or anti-electron as an antiparticle to the electron. However, its existence was not definitively confirmed until 1932 by Carl David Anderson, a student who collaborated with Oppenheimer at Caltech. Building upon this foundation, Oppenheimer engaged in close collaboration with Wendell Furry to formulate the contemporary understanding of the electron-positron theory and their mutual interactions. Arguably his most impactful work, however, was a collaborative undertaking with Melba Phillips, one of Oppenheimer's initial doctoral students during a period when female physicists were exceedingly scarce in the United States. Together in 1935, they proposed the Oppenheimer-Phillips process. This process described a type of deuteron-induced nuclear reaction wherein the neutron component of a deuteron fuses with a target nucleus, resulting in the ejection of a proton. This demonstrated that certain elements could be rendered radioactive through bombardment with deuterons, and that nuclear interactions could transpire at lower energy levels than had been previously understood. This breakthrough, along with numerous others achieved by both Oppenheimer and his students at Berkeley and Caltech, firmly established California as a prominent global center for theoretical physics in the mid-20th century. Oppenheimer's personal life during this period was characterized by a degree of disarray. He had received a diagnosis of a mild case of tuberculosis in the late 1920s. In pursuit of relief, he sought out the arid desert climate of Arizona and New Mexico in the ensuing years, ultimately acquiring a ranch in New Mexico. In the mid-1930s, he initiated a romantic involvement with Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student and the daughter of John Strong Tatlock, a distinguished scholar of Old English and an authority on the life and writings of Geoffrey Chaucer. 10 years younger than Robert, Jean was a troubled young woman grappling with profound depression and a conflicted sense of her sexuality. Their relationship was turbulent, yet it persisted until 1940, even after Oppenheimer began a relationship with Kitty Harrison, a botanist and physicist at Caltech. Kitty eventually obtained a divorce from her second husband, Stuart Harrison, in November 1940 and married Robert the following day. It remains uncertain to this day whether Oppenheimer continued to have intermittent contact with Tatlock in the early 1940s, prior to her suicide in January 1944. Robert and Kitty would subsequently have 2 children, a son named Peter, born in May 1941, as Kitty was already pregnant at the time of their marriage, and a daughter named Catherine after her mother, born in 1944. Oppenheimer's life, much like the lives of virtually all individuals across Europe, North Africa, North America, and a considerable portion of Asia, experienced a profound disruption in the autumn of 1939 with the commencement of the Second World War. This conflict arose as a direct consequence of the Nazis' ascent to power in Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler in early 1933. A vehemently anti-Semitic, nationalist, and fascist organization, the Nazis harbored 2 primary objectives: the eradication of the Jewish population in Germany and the instigation of a new war in Europe to overturn the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, which had concluded the First World War, and to establish a new German Third Reich, or empire, that would assert dominance over the continent. Oppenheimer possessed a thorough familiarity with the Nazis. As a Jew himself, albeit a non-observant one, He had become politically engaged for the first time in his life during the mid-1930s. He began allocating 3% of his earnings to provide assistance to German Jews endeavoring to flee Germany in the aftermath of the anti-Jewish Nuremberg laws, which were enacted from 1934 onward. The Nazis' anti-Jewish policies intensified from 1936 onward, and particularly so in 1938, as Germany initiated the annexation of neighboring nations, commencing with Austria and subsequently Czechoslovakia. Following the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. However, public sentiment in the United States was not yet entirely supportive of intervention in what was perceived as a European conflict. Consequently, America would maintain a formal stance of neutrality for the initial 2 years of the war, although the administration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt provided substantial assistance in the form of war materiel to Britain from the conflict's outset. Oppenheimer's life and his historical significance would be irrevocably transformed by the events of December 1941. By that juncture, the United States persisted in its neutrality regarding the Second World War, notwithstanding the dire circumstances prevailing in Europe. The Nazis had conquered Poland in the autumn of 1939, followed by Denmark and Norway the subsequent spring, and then the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940. With numerous other nations, including Italy, Hungary, and Romania, allied with the Nazis, and with invasions of Britain's colonies in North Africa and Russia underway from the summer of 1941, it appeared that Germany was on the cusp of dominating Europe. It was within this context that the Empire of Japan, an ultra-nationalist state with aspirations of establishing an Asiatic and Pacific empire, one that already encompassed Korea, Manchuria, and a significant portion of eastern China by the early 1940s, opted to launch a preemptive strike against the United States without a declaration of war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, along with other American territories like the Philippines on December 7, 1941, propelled the United States into the Second World War. Within a matter of days, the U.S. found itself at war with Germany, Italy, and the other Axis powers, as the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere became embroiled in the conflict. Oppenheimer would soon be thrust into the heart of America's research endeavors during the war. This occurred against the backdrop of Nazi Germany's efforts to obtain a weapon of mass destruction as a means of securing a swift victory. During the 1920s and 1930s, Germany had served as a hub for some of the world's foremost scientists, placing it in an advantageous position to develop a nuclear weapon. Nuclear fission, for example, had been discovered by a team led by Otto Robert Frisch and Lisa Meitner in Berlin in 1938. The Nazis initiated various experimental programs the following year, aimed at leveraging this breakthrough to create a nuclear weapon. Some of these programs centered on the development of a nuclear reactor, while others explored the concept of utilizing heavy water to produce an atomic weapon, with research in this area conducted in Nazi-occupied Norway throughout the war. As early as August 1939, President Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. had received a communication from the Hungarian nuclear physicist Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, alerting the U.S. government to the potential danger posed by these Nazi experiments. Limited action was taken in response to this warning in 1939 or 1940. However, with the United States' entry into the war at the close of 1941, renewed consideration was given to America initiating its own research initiatives in this domain. Oppenheimer would technically hold the position of director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during the Second World War, but this was all encompassed within the broader framework of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a research and development undertaking launched by the U.S. government in 1942 with the ultimate objective of creating a nuclear bomb. The name itself is derived from the fact that the group of individuals responsible for overseeing the overall project convened their initial headquarters meetings in 1942 on the island of Manhattan in New York City. From 1942 onward, the project expanded, ultimately employing an estimated 130,000 individuals across the nation. These individuals labored on diverse facets of the project, spread across numerous states and regions. For instance, a substantial team stationed in Chicago throughout the war, including Oppenheimer's former colleague from Göttingen, Enrico Fermi, and Leo Szilard, who had co-authored the 1939 letter to Roosevelt cautioning the president about the Nazi nuclear program, successfully developed the first operational nuclear reactor. Another team, located at the Hanford site in Washington State, was assigned the task of producing plutonium from uranium, serving as a raw material for any future nuclear weapons. A parallel project was underway in Tennessee. Additionally, there were teams operating under the auspices of the Manhattan Project in Europe, engaged in espionage activities to ascertain the progress of the Nazis' research. Oppenheimer would assume oversight of the most crucial research team among all those participating in the Manhattan Project, serving in the capacity of director of the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. His selection for this role was very nearly not realized. The individual responsible for supervising the Manhattan Project was Major General Leslie Groves. While Groves may not be a widely recognized figure today, he holds the distinction of having overseen both the Manhattan Project, which resulted in the creation of the first nuclear weapon, and the construction of the Pentagon, serving as the headquarters for the U.S. military and Department of Defense. Oppenheimer was put forward to Groves in 1942 as a potential candidate to lead a team of theoretical physicists and scientists as an integral component of the Manhattan Project. However, Groves initially harbored reservations, expressing a preference for appointing an individual who had been awarded a Nobel Prize in physics, thereby possessing the requisite academic standing to lead a team comprising some of the most distinguished minds of the era. He was ultimately persuaded that Oppenheimer possessed a demonstrable history of maximizing the potential of those with whom he collaborated. He initiated contact with Oppenheimer and, following an interview, reached the determination that he was exceptionally well suited for the position. In the ensuing weeks during the early winter of 1942, Oppenheimer conducted a search for a suitable location to establish a research center, opting for a remote site far removed from any urban populations, where confidentiality could be maintained and a nuclear weapon could be tested in due course. His eventual selection was Los Alamos in New Mexico, where a research facility was constructed on the grounds of a former school. This undertaking was subcontracted to the University of California through the War Department, affording Oppenheimer a degree of latitude in personnel decisions, both hiring and dismissal, in his capacity as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. However, hiring significantly outnumbered firing. At its zenith, the Los Alamos facility employed well in excess of 5,000 individuals, substantially surpassing Oppenheimer's initial projections. The team assembled by Oppenheimer at Los Alamos encompassed some of the most brilliant scientific minds of the first half of the 20th century. One such individual was John Hasbrouck Van Vleck, a physicist and mathematician who had been at Harvard during Oppenheimer's arrival in 1922. He was subsequently honored with a Nobel Prize in 1977 in recognition of his work on electronic magnetism. Van Vleck made substantial contributions to the gun design that would ultimately be incorporated into the bomb deployed over Hiroshima. Robert Serber, a colleague of Oppenheimer's from Berkeley, served as an organizing physicist at Los Alamos. He would eventually bestow the names Thin Man, Little Boy, and Fat Man upon the bombs employed in the initial test explosion and against Japan, drawing inspiration from characters featured in detective films and novels such as The Maltese Falcon. Hans Bethe, a theoretical physicist of German origin, would later be awarded a Nobel Prize in 1967. He played a pivotal role in calculating the critical mass of the bombs engineered at Los Alamos. Finally, Edward Teller, a Hungarian-born Jew, was recruited to the Los Alamos laboratory. He had pursued his studies in Germany around the same period as Oppenheimer in the late 1920s, but had subsequently emigrated to the United States. Prior to his assignment in New Mexico, Teller had already been engaged in work at Fermi's Reactor Center in Chicago. Teller was arguably Oppenheimer's closest collaborator at Los Alamos. In addition to these prominent figures, hundreds of other engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and military experts participated in the research teams at Los Alamos, meticulously addressing a vast array of intricate details pertaining to the construction of the first atomic weapon. The challenge confronting this assemblage of physicists, engineers, and scientists was formidable. Upon their gathering at Los Alamos, they possessed minimal resources beyond a theoretical understanding of the principles underlying a nuclear chain reaction. However, it is crucial to bear in mind, in an era where we are familiar with the visual manifestation of a nuclear explosion and the devastation it wreaks, that Oppenheimer and his colleagues at Los Alamos were not merely striving to construct a nuclear weapon, but also to forecast the events that would transpire upon its detonation. Consequently, a substantial amount of experimentation and theoretical speculation was undertaken throughout 1943 and 1944. Throughout this period, Oppenheimer maintained an exhaustive work ethic. As Hans Bethe later recollected, his extraordinary swiftness in grasping the core elements of any subject proved to be a decisive factor. He possessed the capacity to familiarize himself with the essential particulars of every facet of the work. He did not exercise his leadership from a remote office. He maintained an intellectual and even physical presence at each critical juncture. However, the exceedingly demanding work regimen that Oppenheimer adhered to at Los Alamos exacted a considerable toll on his physical well-being. He had always maintained a slender physique, but during his tenure in New Mexico, he shed an additional 20 pounds, ultimately weighing as little as 110 pounds or less than 8 stone. During the course of 1943, research endeavors at Los Alamos began to concentrate on a prototype designated Thin Man. This was a plutonium gun-type weapon designed to function more akin to an artillery piece for detonation rather than an implosion-type bomb. The research associated with its development was remarkably complex from a logistical standpoint. The polonium employed in the initiator necessitated procurement from ores located in Ontario, Canada, followed by manufacturing at a separate facility in Tennessee, which also formed part of the broader Manhattan Project, or at the Hanford site in Washington State. However, the design presented even greater intricacies. For the gun-type weapon to achieve functionality, a plutonium bullet, which would be propelled within the bomb, needed to attain a velocity of 3,000 feet per second, equivalent to over 3,200 kilometers per hour. Otherwise, the nuclear fission process would commence prior to the remaining mechanical components of the bomb being prepared for a successful detonation. This requirement ultimately proved to be the insurmountable obstacle for the Thin Man design. During 1944, it was determined that the gun barrel necessary to generate this velocity would be excessively large for deployment in a bomb of a configuration that could be transported aboard a B-29 Flying Superfortress, the newly designed heavy bombers designated to carry any nuclear bomb developed by the U.S. government. This constraint, coupled with challenges associated with the utilization of plutonium in a gun-type bomb, resulted in the abandonment of the Thin Man design in April 1944. Following the abandonment of the Thin Man design, Oppenheimer reassigned a significant number of the scientists and engineers who had been dedicated to it to a different design, known as Little Boy. This represented a streamlined gun-type fission bomb. However, in contrast to the Thin Man, the intention was to utilize uranium-235, instead of plutonium for the nuclear fission that would generate the explosive force. Concurrently, a third design was undergoing development. The Fat Man, as it was designated, would employ plutonium, but was conceived as an implosion-type bomb. The design team responsible for this project was under the leadership of an American physicist named Seth Nettermeyer. Oppenheimer maintained a preference for the gun-type design, even as the Fat Man was being refined throughout 1943 and 1944. Oppenheimer's supervisory brilliance at Los Alamos was evident in his decision to bring John von Neumann, a mathematician and physicist of Hungarian origin, to Los Alamos in 1943 to conduct a design review. It was von Neumann who proposed a spherical configuration and shaped charges. This would reduce the requisite quantity of plutonium and render the assembly of an implosion-type bomb more practical and achievable. Over the subsequent months, metallurgists at Los Alamos faced the challenge of devising a method to cast plutonium into a spherical shape. This obstacle was ultimately overcome through the development of a plutonium-gallium alloy, which was pressed into spheres and coated with nickel. The design process was steadily approaching its culmination. As 1945 commenced at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's teams were on the verge of completing both the Little Boy and Fat Man designs. Consequently, two viable candidates for a successfully constructed nuclear weapon existed. Ultimately, both would be finalized around the same time frame, as design challenges were resolved during the spring of 1945, and the necessary quantities of enriched uranium and plutonium were produced at the facilities in Washington State and Tennessee. These production efforts represented monumental undertakings, considering the technology accessible to the Manhattan Project. The enrichment of these materials to achieve fissile properties was an exceedingly costly and time-intensive process in the mid-1940s. Other elements requiring resolution were primarily of an engineering nature. For instance, the Fat Man bomb was initially assembled using a vast array of approximately 1,500 bolts in 1944, an impractical number for the development of a functional device. By the time of its completion in the early summer of 1945, Oppenheimer's team had successfully reduced this number to a mere 90 bolts. Additional technical considerations pertain to the bomb's descent trajectory upon release from a high altitude. Throughout 1944 and 1945, tests were conducted to evaluate how a bomb of the size and structure of the Fat Man and Little Boy would behave during its fall through the atmosphere. All of these endeavors converged during the spring of 1945. By midsummer, Oppenheimer was in a position to convey to the head of the Manhattan Project, Major General Leslie Groves, the news that they were prepared to proceed with a test detonation. The Trinity nuclear test was executed in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. Fittingly, the desert's name, when translated from Spanish, signifies Dead Man's Root. Oppenheimer disclosed in correspondence with Groves in 1962 that he had chosen the codename Trinity for the test due to his contemporaneous reading of the religious poetry of the 17th century English poet John Donne. The device utilized during the test was a Fat Man bomb, employing plutonium and of the implosion type. For the purposes of the test, the bomb in question was christened the Gadget. To ensure the safe execution of the test, a location was selected that was exceptionally remote, almost entirely devoid of human presence, and otherwise isolated. Only one structure existed on the designated blast site, the McDonald Ranch House. It had been constructed there by a German immigrant in 1913 and was forcibly vacated in 1942 by the McDonald family after the U.S. government assumed control of the region under the authority of the Manhattan Project. The test was meticulously orchestrated, as the plutonium to be utilized had cost billions of dollars to produce in contemporary currency, reflecting the arduous processes involved in enriching uranium and plutonium at that time. A great deal hinged upon its success. As Groves remarked at the time, he did not wish to find himself in the position of explaining to a congressional committee why he had detonated $1 billion worth of plutonium in the desert without achieving any tangible result. The Trinity test was conducted near dawn on the morning of July 16th. Observation shelters were established at 3 distinct locations, to the north, south, and west of the blast site, each positioned approximately 9 kilometers from the point of the bomb's detonation. Goggles were distributed to provide protection against harmful ultraviolet wavelengths, while the distance was deemed sufficiently safe with respect to the radioactive half-life that would be generated. A significant number of the observers present that morning were scientists, including Oppenheimer, Teller, Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and John von Neumann. Some harbored doubts regarding the bomb's functionality. Others expressed concerns about its precise level of destructiveness. Their questions were answered at 5:29 a.m., when the gadget detonated, unleashing explosive energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT. This detonation generated a crater with a diameter of 1/3 of a kilometer, melting the sand across the launch site and transforming it into a light green glass-like substance. The observers situated 9 kilometers away did not perceive the immense sound emanating from the shock wave until 40 seconds after the detonation. However, by that time, they were witnessing the ascent of a burgeoning fireball, its color shifting from purple, green, and orange, and ultimately to white. It then coalesced into a mushroom cloud which spiraled upward to a height of 12 kilometers. The shockwave from the explosion was felt nearly 100 kilometers distant. Those stationed at the observation shelters 9 kilometers away later recounted experiencing a brief but intense sensation of heat, akin to standing in front of an open oven for a few fleeting seconds at the moment of the bomb's detonation. Oppenheimer's purported remarks as he observed the Trinity test explosion have acquired a degree of notoriety in contemporary times. He is alleged to have quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most sacred texts, composed during the latter half of the first millennium BC, the title of which roughly translates to The Song by God. The Gita is a 700-verse scripture primarily focusing on Prince Arjuna and his guide, the Hindu deity Krishna, encompassing a broad spectrum of moral and religious themes. A widespread misconception exists that Oppenheimer quoted a line from the Gita in which another Hindu god, Vishnu, proclaims, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Although this line would have been an apt utterance on that New Mexico morning, in actuality, Oppenheimer never spoke those words. Instead, when reminiscing about the event 2 decades later, he stated that a different line from the Gita had resonated in his mind, one that declares, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One." Upon further reflection in 1965, he acknowledged that the other line might have been more fitting. However, despite the myth that has proliferated, Oppenheimer never actually uttered the phrase, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Nevertheless, for what in retrospect should have been a moment of profound gravity, the prevailing reaction within the observation shelters was one of elation at the successful culmination of the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer, it was later noted, exhibited a state of jubilation. The repercussions of their achievement, however, would become starkly apparent within a mere matter of weeks. Within weeks following the Trinity test explosion, the atomic bomb would be deployed as a weapon of war. By that point, the conflict in Europe had drawn to a close, as the Allies had converged on Germany from both the east and west during the spring of 1945, culminating in Hitler's suicide in Berlin in late April and the Nazis' surrender just over a week later. However, the Empire of Japan had displayed no indication of a willingness to surrender. Japanese systems of honor and military culture strongly suggested that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be necessary to conclude the war in the Pacific. The US government had calculated that such an invasion could potentially result in millions of casualties, as the Japanese were expected to fight to the bitter end. As a result, a decision was promptly reached to use the newly created atomic bomb as a display of force to the Japanese government, showcasing the novel weapon now possessed by the administration. The administration was now under the leadership of President Harry Truman, who had assumed office following President Roosevelt's passing in mid-April 1945. This decision culminated in the bombing of Hiroshima, a Japanese city, with one of the Little Boy bombs on August 6, 1945. That evening in Los Alamos, Oppenheimer expressed a sense of triumph, seemingly regretting that the weapon had not been ready for deployment against the Nazis in Germany. However, this sentiment swiftly transformed into one of disappointment 3 days later when the United States detonated a second bomb of the Fat Man design over the city of Nagasaki, also in Japan. Oppenheimer and his associates reasoned that this action was surely unjustifiable. After all, the Japanese had not been afforded adequate time to consider the ramifications of the initial bombing and to deliberate on surrender, a decision they ultimately reached 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing. With that act, the war concluded. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as the sole instances in global history where nuclear weapons have been employed in armed conflict. Consequently, they remain profoundly contentious. Presently, the majority of analysts examining the events of August 1945 align with the perspective held by Oppenheimer and his colleagues. They believe the deployment of the first bomb on Hiroshima was, to some extent, defensible, albeit deeply lamentable, as a tactic to compel Japanese surrender and potentially avert the loss of millions of lives by circumventing a ground invasion of the Japanese islands. However, a consensus exists that the bombing of Nagasaki, a mere 3 days later, was without justification. On a wider scale, the ethical dimensions of the endeavors undertaken by Oppenheimer and his colleagues within the Manhattan Project during the war have been subject to scrutiny. This issue presents two contrasting viewpoints. On one side, the creation of nuclear weaponry has posed an existential risk to humanity's continued existence in the contemporary era. Conversely, the nuclear deterrent has played a role in preventing major conflicts between global superpowers and significant nations since 1945. For many centuries, Europe's nations had engaged in incessant warfare with one another. This pattern shifted dramatically when it became evident that direct confrontation could lead to mutual annihilation. Ironically, the development of nuclear weapons has contributed to the emergence of a nuclear peace. Nonetheless, substantial risks persist in a world where political landscapes are increasingly marked by antagonism and instability in the 21st century. With the war's cessation, Oppenheimer's stature within American academic spheres reached unparalleled heights. Consequently, new prospects became available to him. He chose to depart from Berkeley and relocate to the East Coast, assuming the role of director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, New Jersey in 1947. This esteemed institution for the study of physics in the United States boasted Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, and Paul Dirac as former charter members or visiting fellows. Under Oppenheimer's stewardship, the institute evolved into a focal point for burgeoning physicists. Upon his departure from Berkeley, half a dozen of his most talented graduate students also left to pursue studies at Princeton. In New Jersey, he perpetuated the methodologies he had cultivated in California during the 1930s, fostering an atmosphere of vigorous discourse and inquiry, frequently prioritizing these activities over his own personal research. Oppenheimer opted to produce very little written work himself at Princeton. As a consequence, the institute ascended to the position of the foremost center for physics studies in the United States during the late 1940s and early 1950s. A considerable number of the most influential physicists of the latter half of the 20th century passed through the institute during Oppenheimer's directorship. Notable among these were Yoichiro Nambu, a Japanese-American physicist who would be jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in 2008 for his contribution to the discovery of spontaneous broken symmetry in subatomic physics, and Murray Gell-Mann, who received the Nobel Prize in 1969 for his work on elementary particles. In addition to his responsibilities at Princeton, Oppenheimer retained several governmental roles throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s. He also maintained security clearance, granting him access to classified documents and materials pertaining to the United States' developing nuclear program. A significant aspect of his government involvement was his participation in the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, established in 1947 as a commission under the leadership of the United Nations, itself a recently created organization aimed at promoting global peace in the war's aftermath. The Energy Commission was entrusted with the task of overseeing the proliferation of nuclear materials and the advancement of nuclear armaments. While the United States remained the sole nation with access to nuclear bombs for several years after 1945, it was inevitable that, with the world now aware of the feasibility of developing such weapons, other nation-states would embark on their own bomb-building endeavors or seek to acquire them. Oppenheimer and several of his former associates from the Manhattan Project played a pivotal role in efforts during 1946 and 1947 to establish limitations on nuclear proliferation that remain in effect today. As the Commission's inaugural chairman, Oppenheimer endeavored to dissuade a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union within the context of the escalating Cold War. However, these endeavors proved futile, and a substantial nuclear arms race ensued once the Soviets successfully tested a nuclear weapon in 1949. Upon the U.S. learning of the Soviet Union's acquisition of a nuclear weapon in 1949, discussions commenced within President Harry Truman's administration regarding the creation of a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. This would be a significantly more potent nuclear weapon than the atomic bombs developed under the Manhattan Project and deployed against Japan in 1945. Oppenheimer, along with numerous other scientists who had participated in the work at the Los Alamos Laboratory between 1942 and 1945, voiced opposition to this proposal. They contended that such a weapon could not be practically employed in warfare without inflicting immense devastation and potentially igniting a nuclear conflict that could obliterate a vast proportion of life on Earth. In their late 1949 petition to the government, they asserted that the extreme danger to mankind inherent in the proposal to develop thermonuclear weapons wholly outweighs any military advantage. Undeterred, Truman proceeded, granting approval for the new program in January 1950. Almost 3 years later, in November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was detonated on an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Codenamed Ivy Mike, the bomb yielded an explosion equivalent to over 10 million tons of TNT, surpassing the power of the atomic bomb dropped by the US on Nagasaki in 1945 by a factor of 450. Despite the reservations articulated by Oppenheimer and numerous others, the Cold War was progressing toward an era of mutually assured destruction. Despite his pivotal role in the Manhattan Project and his long-standing service as a senior government scientist, Oppenheimer encountered difficulties with the government in the early 1950s during the Second Red Scare. These years were marked by an intensification of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, fueled by the division of Germany into a Western-aligned West Germany and a communist East Germany. The formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact as competing military alliances, coupled with the Korean War, which, for the first time, pitted the Western and Communist blocs against each other in a major proxy conflict. Within this atmosphere, America became gripped by what initially began as legitimate apprehensions regarding communist organizations within the United States, potentially serving as a fifth column for the Soviet Union. However, these concerns rapidly devolved into intense, unsubstantiated paranoia concerning the motivations of anyone associated with socialist ideologies, or even groups like the American Civil Liberties Union. The Second Red Scare, so named to differentiate it from the First Red Scare that impacted America in the late 1910s following the Russian Revolution of 1917, gained momentum from the late 1940s. It reached its peak intensity between 1950 and 1954, as Senator Joseph McCarthy undertook extensive campaigns to identify and prosecute individuals even remotely suspected of harboring communist sympathies. Oppenheimer soon became a target of suspicion during the Second Red Scare. His connections to socialist and left-leaning political movements and civil liberties organizations in America dated back to the mid-1930s. After maintaining a largely apolitical stance throughout his youth, he finally began to develop an interest in political matters. This newfound interest led him to affiliate with several left-wing and progressive movements during a period when socialist parties and organizations were perceived as the natural opposition to the burgeoning fascist tide across Europe. This was particularly evident from 1936 onward, when the Soviet Union and other communist parties provided support to the Republicans against the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. It is important to emphasize, however, that Oppenheimer never formally joined the Communist Party of the United States. Nevertheless, numerous individuals in his close circle were active members, including Jean Tatlock, with whom he had a romantic relationship from 1936 onward, his wife Kitty, and his brother Frank. Other organizations with which Robert was involved, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, were also deemed radical between the 1930s and 1950s. These are now recognized as forerunners of the civil rights movement that ultimately dismantled segregation after nearly a century. These associations collectively contributed to Oppenheimer being viewed with a degree of suspicion by the authorities. This scrutiny was further amplified by his father's German birth once the United States entered the Second World War, although this was a complete contradiction, as Oppenheimer's Jewish heritage would have rendered him persona non grata to the Nazi regime in Berlin. Despite this, suspicions surrounding Oppenheimer persisted. He was even subjected to surveillance throughout America's participation in the Second World War, a paradoxical situation where he held a prominent position within the Manhattan Project, while the FBI concurrently maintained an open file on him. These matters converged by 1949, leading to Oppenheimer being compelled to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee regarding his political affiliations. During his testimony, he acknowledged connections to the Communist Party and disclosed that many of his prominent students at Berkeley in the 1930s had also been official party members. However, he maintained that he had never personally been a member. Little further action resulted from the interrogation at that time. However, 4 years later, in the early winter of 1953, the accusations against Oppenheimer were revived. On this occasion, the FBI was convinced, albeit erroneously, that Oppenheimer was a Soviet operative functioning within the United States. This reflected the prevailing level of paranoia within America during the Second Red Scare. In mid-December 1953, Oppenheimer's security clearance for the U.S. government was rescinded, and he was urged to relinquish his government positions. Oppenheimer refused to comply, demanding a hearing. This hearing was conducted behind closed doors in the late spring of 1954. During the proceedings, Oppenheimer was thoroughly undermined by his former colleague Edward Teller, who testified that he had at times found Oppenheimer's conduct questionable during his tenure as director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. As a result of this betrayal, Oppenheimer was stripped of his security clearance and relegated to the political and social periphery in the mid-1950s. The subsequent years following his security hearing and the loss of his clearance proved challenging for Oppenheimer. The response within the academic community was divided. The majority of his colleagues stood in defense of Oppenheimer. However, the bureaucrats and administrators overseeing American universities were often less supportive, leading to the cancellation of numerous lectures and appearances that Oppenheimer had been scheduled to deliver. Oppenheimer's own self-assurance was diminished, and he abstained from overt participation in various initiatives spearheaded by individuals like Einstein to caution the government and American society about the perils of unchecked nuclear proliferation. Instead, he increasingly distanced himself from the continental United States, relocating to the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, a U.S. overseas territory. There, he acquired an estate on what was then known as Gibney Beach on the island of St. John, which has since colloquially been renamed Oppenheimer Beach. He resided there for extended periods from 1957 onward, although numerous institutions and organizations within America continue to extend invitations for him to deliver guest lectures. Nevertheless, the 1950s represented a notably barren period for him in terms of research, during which he published virtually nothing. By the late 1950s, concerted endeavors were underway to rehabilitate Oppenheimer's reputation internationally. For example, in 1957, the French government bestowed upon him the Légion d'honneur in acknowledgement of his wartime contributions to the Allied cause. In 1962, he was inducted as a foreign member of the Royal Society in Britain. By that time, there was a growing recognition within America that the Second Red Scare had been excessively zealous in its pursuit of individuals who had only tenuous associations with the American Communist movement and lacked any genuine connections to the Soviet Union. Consequently, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy took steps to rehabilitate Oppenheimer by awarding him the Enrico Fermi Award. This award had been established in 1956 by the U.S. Department of Energy and named in honor of Enrico Fermi, the Italian-American scientist who had developed the world's first nuclear reactor in Chicago in 1942 as part of the initial phases of the Manhattan Project and who had succumbed to stomach cancer prematurely in 1954. The award had previously been conferred upon several individuals who had been part of the Los Alamos laboratory under Oppenheimer's direction between 1943 and 1945, including von Neumann, Bethe, and Teller, in 1956, 1961, and 1962, respectively. Therefore, Oppenheimer's receipt of the award in 1963 was somewhat overdue, but represented a welcome acknowledgement of the government's error in persecuting him as part of the Red Scare. Oppenheimer did not have a long time to enjoy this partial restoration of his reputation. 2 years after receiving the Fermi Award, he was diagnosed in late 1965 with throat cancer, an ailment undoubtedly attributable to his lifelong habit of chain smoking. This was a period when numerous forms of cancer that are now treatable were effectively terminal illnesses. Thus, despite undergoing aggressive chemotherapy in an attempt to extend his life, Oppenheimer lapsed into a coma in early 1967 and passed away at his home in Princeton on February 18th. He was 62 years old. While the bestowal of the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963 had only partially rehabilitated his reputation, and many political figures continued to regard him with suspicion, the academic community unequivocally demonstrated its esteem for Oppenheimer at a funeral service. The service was attended by over 600 colleagues from academia, the scientific community, and the military, a substantial number of whom had collaborated with Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. His ashes were subsequently scattered in the waters off St. John's Island in the Caribbean, contained within an urn. In the ensuing decades, his reputation has undergone complete rehabilitation. In stark contrast, Edward Teller, who had testified against Oppenheimer during his closed-door hearing in 1954, was shunned by many within the American scientific community for years to come. In 1967, Oppenheimer received a posthumous nomination for the Nobel Prize in Physics for the third time. He had previously been nominated in 1946 and 1951, but had not been awarded the accolade on those occasions, nor did he receive it in 1967. Considerable discussion has taken place over the years regarding the reasons for his not receiving the Nobel Prize, considering his extensive achievements. However, there appear to be clear explanations for this. Firstly, Oppenheimer's publication record was not extensive, unlike Albert Einstein, who published over 300 scientific papers during his lifetime, along with numerous books in his later years. In contrast, Oppenheimer published a mere 5 academic papers after the Second World War. Furthermore, while he made contributions to various fields of inquiry within physics, he did not achieve the kind of groundbreaking theoretical or applied discovery in any single specific area that would typically warrant a Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prizes are not bestowed for a cumulative body of work over a lifetime, but rather for a particular scientific accomplishment. Einstein, for instance, received his primarily for his contributions to the understanding of the photoelectric effect. Consequently, Oppenheimer was deemed not to have merited a Nobel Prize for his individual scientific contributions, although some have speculated that his work on gravitational collapse might have been deserving. His principal accomplishments throughout his career resided in collaborative endeavors and the supervision of teams comprising physicists and other scientists. It was this capacity that rendered him the ideal candidate to lead the Los Alamos laboratory during the war. Robert Oppenheimer stands as one of history's most significant theoretical physicists. His research and work spanning from the 1920s to the 1960s significantly enhanced our comprehension of the universe. Notable examples include the manner in which the Born-Oppenheimer approximation revolutionized our understanding of molecular dynamics from 1927 onward, and how the Oppenheimer-Phillips process elucidated deuteron-induced nuclear reactions, following Oppenheimer and Melba Phillips's explanation of this phenomenon in 1935. However, he will perpetually be remembered for his involvement in the Manhattan Project as the director of the Los Alamos Laboratory. In this role, Oppenheimer could be considered the leading physicist in the United States' efforts to create an atomic bomb during the Second World War. Irrespective of the existential and moral implications of introducing such weapons into the world, there is no disputing that this research was deemed imperative within the context of the era. Oppenheimer was evidently deeply disturbed by what he and his colleagues had unleashed upon the world. He dedicated a significant portion of the post-war period to advocating against the development of even more lethal weapons of mass destruction. It was partly due to this stance that he found himself persecuted and prosecuted by the very government he had served in the early 1950s, and subsequently exiled as a consequence of the Second Red Scare. His legacy, however, remains vibrant and enduring today. An eccentric individual who perceived the physical universe through a mystical lens, Oppenheimer should undoubtedly be regarded as one of the preeminent scientists of the modern age. What are your thoughts on Robert Oppenheimer? Was he the most pivotal figure involved in the Manhattan Project, and should he have been honored with a Nobel Prize? Please share your insights in the comments section, and in the meantime, I extend my sincere gratitude for your attention.